Good evening. I'm Barbie Zelizer, Director of the Scholars Program, and I welcome you to tonight's lecture. There are moments in the Academy when a really central figure turns up on one's doorstep, and then the question really is, what does one do? Stutter in admiration, feign ignorance, or attempt one-upsmanship? Graeme Turner is one of those figures. As large in reputation as he is humble in person, he first came into my life about a decade ago when I was winding across Australia on behalf of the University of Pennsylvania trying to figure out how communication fit into the Australian landscape. I landed in his office where he, a critical figure in cultural studies way before I ever knew what cultural studies was, patiently and clearly mapped out the place of communication and culture writ broadly, not only in Australia but across the world. This, I think, was telling, because though he is Australian-born, Turner is way larger than Down Under. Trained in both Canada and the UK in literature, he inhabits the curious space of being a concrete figure in his native Australia, a legendary figure beyond. Presently an Australian Research Council Federation Fellow and Professor of Cultural Studies and Director of the Centre for Critical and Cultural Studies at the University of Queensland, Turner is one of the few cultural folk I know who get regularly positioned on wide-ranging humanities and social sciences commissions, not only as the convener of the aforementioned ARC Fellowship, but also as past president of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and the second humanities scholar in history to serve on the Australian Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council. He's the recipient of multiple awards, including an Australian Literary Society Award and 2 New South Wales Literary Awards, and the author of some 20 books and monographs, one of them, British Cultural Studies, probably the single most accessible text in the entire field of cultural studies work, but all of them meriting kudos for their ability to make complex ideas about culture, celebrity, nationalism, television, and popular culture not only understandable, but instrumental to an understanding of the broader field of how cultural analysis takes shape. He's also written over 50 book chapters, 12 edited journals, and nearly 60 peer-reviewed articles, has lectured literally across the world in Australia and New Zealand, but also North America, Europe, and Asia, and has been a consultant to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the Australia Council, the Australian Consolidated Press, and the Australian Key Centre for Cultural and Media Policy. He's also a musician. A veritable lifetime of achievement, and yet it is revealing that little of these accomplishments can be found on Turner's resume, for he is as modest and understated as he is accomplished. So in that light, I invite you to celebrate he who will not celebrate himself, and welcome Graeme Turner as he speaks on Convergence and Divergence, the international experience of television in the digital age.
Thanks, Barbie. That was wonderful. Maybe I should just sit down. I should also like to take this opportunity of thanking Barbie and the Scholars Program here at the Annenberg School for the invitation to spend this semester here. It's been a fantastic experience so far, and I think it's only going to get better. I suppose if I make a mess of this lecture, it'll go downhill. But it's been great, and I've met a lot of terrific people here. I'm enjoying teaching the students. I don't even mind the snow, you know. It's a novelty to me, and I don't have a car, so it doesn't bother me driving around trying to get to deal with it. So thanks, Barbie, for the invitation. It's been a terrific thing to do. Okay, look, I don't have a PowerPoint to show you. This is a written paper, so I'm actually going to read it to you. So I hope that's not going to create problems of comprehension, but that's what I'm going to do. At the end of her account of American television, which is called The Television Will Be Revolutionised, which many of you will have read, Amanda Lotz provides a telling demonstration of the culture of use that has developed around the new technologies that enable the consumption of television in the so-called digital age. Once, Lotz reminds us, the use of television typically involved walking into a room, turning on the set, and either tuning to specific content or commencing the process of channel surfing. Now, however, it's not so simple, and I quote from her book. My DVR is set to automatically record The Daily Show Monday through Thursday and keep 2 episodes. Typically, I automatically record only one cable series, I set a season pass in TV vernacular, because I often forget when they're on, and I usually take advantage of a late night replay of episodes so that I can record something on a broadcast network during the prime time airing. My DVR is only one tuner, so I can only record one show at a time, and it holds only 30 hours of extended programming, which also affects how I use the device. I'll stop there, but it continues for several pages as she details the practices that she's adopted as a means of appropriately dealing with the range of choices available to her. Now, this degree of deliberation, when picked up among the interviews for David Morley's book Family Television back in 1986, was gently derided at the time. After quoting a similarly detailed account of one viewer's choices, this time he was using a VCR, the bemused Dave Morley marvelled at, quote, the bottomless pit of this man's desire for programs to watch, unquote. Today, such behaviour may no longer be so aberrant. Well, I live in Australia, where there's been a reasonable degree of media convergence. Broadcast, cable, satellite and some online video platforms are available in most locations, and the US is routinely regarded as the model for the media market's development and thus for the policy settings required for the future. Nonetheless, many of the options available to Amanda Lotz remain unavailable to me. TiVo arrived last year but is constrained by its affiliation with only one of the 3 free-to-air networks. Other kinds of DVRs are available, although expensive, but they can't access cable. For that, the leading cable network has its own DVR, which is available at a premium to its subscribers. Other aspects of the wider industry context are different as well. Broadcast television still dominates, with cable penetration at around 30%, but the audience share hovering around 20%, and total television viewership is shrinking as other forms of entertainment compete. Cable has been in place for only a decade and a half. The range of channels is more limited than that available in the US, and thus we don't have the extensive menu of choices that Amanda Lotz must navigate. In terms of what most people watch on TV, news and current affairs programming is the dominant presence, as it has been for the last 50 years. It fills the top 10 rating programs every week. And the competitors are locally produced comedy, drama and reality television, with the emphasis on locally produced. The point I'm making here is that although most of us talk about television without any qualifying prefix such as Australian or American, the fact is that, especially since the digital revolution and notwithstanding the processes of globalisation, television now involves such varying forms, platforms and content in its different national and regional locations that it's increasingly implausible for one set of experiences to be regarded as representative. Examining, capturing and understanding some of those differences are among the primary objectives of a large international comparative study of what we are calling post-broadcast television, in which I'm currently engaged in collaboration with 2 colleagues, Anna Pertiera and Gina Tay, and I've talked about this briefly in a colloquium earlier on last month. Within Anglo-American media and cultural studies, it's become something of an orthodoxy to see television as engaged in a process that has the medium moving from regulation to deregulation, from a mix of public and private ownership to overwhelming commercialisation, and from broadcast and cable into broadband. The research project I'm involved with questions how comprehensively such an orthodoxy covers the various formations of television around the world today, while also considering what kinds of social and cultural roles that the current formations of television now play within the nation state, the local community or the transnational geolinguistic region. This ongoing study informs much of what I'm going to say in this lecture. Now, we're not the only ones to contest this orthodoxy, of course, and last week's forum on the end of television demonstrated that. While I would argue that there is certainly a dominant view which foregrounds the death of broadcasting on the one hand and the rise of user-generated alternative content online on the other, it'd be wrong to say there's anything like a settled consensus within the international fields of media, television and cultural studies about the possible futures of post-broadcast television. Indeed, there are some extremely stark contrasts between the opposing points of view, some of which see no future for television at all. Axel Bruns, for instance, presents an account of the growth of online video and in particular what he calls forms of producerage, which are DIY or user-generated content. that proposes them as the core rather than the periphery of the development of the future of television, or what he prefers to call audiovisual distribution. Bruns claims that, quote, conventional television technology constitutes only a second-rate, impoverished version of live streaming media, providing only the creaky and unreliable technology of audiovisual distribution of the analogue mass media age, unquote. The range of options now available on digital platforms, he says, to request, play on demand, pause, restart, rewind, save, share or retransmit content, leave television behind. Quote, what becomes obvious here, claims Bruns, is that the technologies and processes of television, once constituting an effective and powerful network for widespread content distribution, have now been outclassed by the internet, unquote. In what's admittedly a polemical piece, Bruns doesn't say how he has come to the conclusion that television has been outclassed, or indeed what that might actually mean. But he is far from alone in making such claims about the death of broadcast television and about the potential of online platforms for a new world of DIY content distribution. We keep on bumping into people who work in the digital media. I heard something called a social networking analyst. I didn't know such a thing existed, actually. I heard that on radio a while back, and she was referring not only to legacy media, which I'd heard television referred to as legacy media, but she called it heritage media, which I thought was pretty cheeky. Anyway, these claims, however, don't go uncontested. Joseph Strobauer notably insists that it's still true, and will be true for many years to come, that most of the people who watch television around the world do so via broadcasting networks. Some have a choice in this, but others do not. And here's a quote from Strobauer. He says, many of those concerned about impacts of satellite and cable television technology fail to recognise that most people in the world do not have access to them, either because they cannot afford them, because governments like China restrict access to them, or because they are sufficiently satisfied with broadcast television that they choose not to pay for access to them, unquote. At some point, he reminds us, our assessment of the significance of the multiplication of digital platforms of delivery has to include an accounting of how uneven, globally, their distribution and take-up has been. It is little wonder that those required to respond to the pace and effects of these changes should have difficulty in sorting out how they might influence the future shape of a post-broadcast global television industry. I attended the 2008 conference of the National Association of Television Programming Executives, NATPE, in Las Vegas. That's another story. And I was struck by how thoroughly it was focused on the role of digital technologies, even though the industry was clearly undecided about their significance for the future. On the one hand, the conference heard Michael Eisner, former head of Disney, and then an independent producer for mobile TV soap, Mobisodes, claiming categorically but completely unconvincingly that the future of television lay in mobile services rather than in cable broadcast or online. There were representatives of Yoast and YouTube in their presentations who told the industry that in their view the future was online. Bruce Leichtman of the Leichtman Research Group spoiled some of the fun by reporting data demonstrating that while it was certainly increasing steadily, online video usage remained a relatively minor component of the US media landscape. According to his research at the time, which was taken from the last quarter of 2007, among those respondents who watched any online video in the months surveyed, the average time per day spent watching video online was 6 minutes, while constituting a significant increase on the previous year. I think it was 3 the previous year. This is still pretty inconsequential when compared to the 3.5 hours that consumers on average spent watching cable or broadcast television in the US market. Now, there may be a minority at present, but there are also what I might call convergent sceptics within media and cultural studies who respond to the projections about shifts in the current mediascape by pointing to the lessons to be learnt from histories of technological change, from the dangers of technological determinism, and finally the undeniable fact that it will be the currently existing commercial and regulatory structures which will exercise the most influence on how all these developments play out in the future. Although there may be some reason to hope that the potential of digital technologies will open the media up to new players, there are many commentators who point out that notwithstanding the proliferation of choices available to consumers today, that the major media corporations have retained their dominance. Furthermore, projections of technologically driven change are often, indeed notoriously, short of substantial evidence. Italian television researcher Millie Buonanno warns of the imprudence of regarding the behaviour of early adopters as representative of possible mainstream trends, something which has always plagued projections about the media industries. I have a personal memory of being informed about the imminence of digital television when I was working in a department that taught film and television in Western Australia, and I was told it was the coming thing, it would be in theatres within a couple of years, and that really I had to prepare myself for a whole new world, and that was 1977. Took a bit longer. Others simply query the empirical basis for the excitement about convergence. Des Friedman quotes evidence that reveals how few sites are actually consulted by internet browsers and how infrequently, there's one survey he refers to, where 42% of users pass through only 5 or less sites per week. It's an entertaining read, his article, actually. It's a rant about that is a full-on attack against digital optimism. From his point of view, the possibility that convergence might drive significant change is limited by factors such as the control of distribution networks by familiar multinational companies, the relatively narrow media consumption patterns of the majority of the population, and the fact that the new technological possibilities of the internet are in the end still constrained by what he calls the same old economic imperatives of the media business. Rather than accepting the claims made for the interactive and DIY potential of media convergence, David Morley describes its celebration as, quote, born-again techno-determinism, unquote, and quotes Friedman's description of the global history of the internet as a process through which the platform has been transformed, quote, from being a mainly non-commercial instrument of information exchange into a highly commercialised tool of mainly private and business transactions, unquote. So in the next section of this lecture, I want to explore these differences a little further by looking at examples of some of the divergent ways in which the future of TV is unfolding. As a starting point, it's important to recognise how geographically specific the end of television thesis is. Once you look beyond North America and Europe, such an argument loses much of its claim to relevance. In most other locations, and remember these would include the largest television audience in the world, which is China, broadcast, let alone television, is far from experiencing decline. Adrian Attique has argued that India, for instance, is only now entering its age of television and its markets are dominated by a multitude of broadcasters. It's a point that Penny Scannell made on Friday at the symposium here. Notwithstanding this, it's true that over the years, policymakers, the media and entertainment industries and media studies academics have all acquired the habit of seeing the development of television as an evolutionary process, which more or less assumes there is a single trajectory that all systems in all locations are bound to follow. As Ginatay and I have discussed elsewhere, the dominant evolutionary model for most Western regulatory jurisdictions is the American experience of television. It seems to be taking quite a while, even in the current circumstances where there are so many provocations, for industry insiders and observers alike to accept what the evidence should be telling them, that there are no longer grounds for thinking about television like that. For a start, it actually might make more sense to regard the American market as significantly anomalous, rather than as standing in an exemplary relation to the rest of the global market. More importantly, though, with the multiplication of formats, platforms, production centres and distribution systems currently in play, it's abundantly clear that the precise configuration of any nation or region's experience of television is going to be the product of the complex interplay between any number of specific conjunctural factors, only one of which will be technological. One area where there are quite dramatic contrasts in the take-up and application of digital television platforms around the world is in the production and consumption of television content distributed via mobile or cell phones, what Michael Eisner insisted at NATPE was the real future of the medium. Now, the cell phone is itself quite a complicated history of adoption, with SMS messaging, for instance, a widely used capability in Asia, but notoriously slow to attract users in the US. I think it's still only running at around 60%. In China, in the material that we managed to find out there, which dates back to 2007, SMS participation rates were set at around 81%, where email participation rates were about 56%. And at that time in the US, email participation rates were up to 91%. So really quite dramatic differences. Mobile television so far remains relatively unimportant in Europe and relatively undeveloped in the US, although it's certainly a prime target for future projections. The use of mobiles for internet access, video distribution, music downloads, news services and so on is growing here, but nothing like the extent to which it is in parts of Asia. Liu and Bruns report that the growth in the number of Chinese consumers who use their mobiles to connect to the web is faster than the growth in the numbers connecting via the internet. And thus they argue that mobiles are the leading edge of convergence there, in much the way that the internet and broadband have been in the West. They speculate that the situation in China may come to mirror that in Japan, where the national enthusiasm for mobile communication has led to mobile-based internet access outstripping internet access through any other means. Now, some researchers have been brave enough to attempt to relate such variations to their cultural origins. Jazz Choi, for instance, connects shifts in the take-up and deployment of mobile phone technology in East Asia to social, contextual and even teleological determinants. While it's now commonplace for media analysts to relate the Japanese effective investment in the mobile phone to the indigenous Ketai culture, which fetishises cute, shiny objects, Choi's article suggests that particular aspects of the functionality of the mobile phone intersect with cultural aspects of what it means to be a subject in South Korea, China and Japan. And by using James Carey's distinction between transmission and ritual models of communication, Choi situates much East Asian use in the ritual mode because of its emphasis on sharing, participation, association, fellowship and the like. And I'll quote a chunk from her article. She says, Korea, China and Japan share a traditionally collective, interdependent and high contextual culture, as opposed to individual, independent and low contextual cultures which are predominantly evident in the West. As East Asian nations, they are heavily influenced by Taoist, Buddhist and Confucian ideologies and therefore often embrace rigid social hierarchy or class distinction, conformity and dedication to one's duties within one's position, unquote. She then goes on to outline three cultural characteristics that she argues play particularly crucial roles in making East Asian cultures unique. The polychronic conception of time, in which the harmonious maintenance of selective relationships is valued over prompt time management, leads, Choi says, to forms of interaction that are, quote, eminently dissimilar to those that occur in monochronic societies, which is the individualist West in its formulation. The other two characteristics she discusses are independent self-definition, analogous to the idea of a network, and face work. In collective societies, this is about saving the face of others as well as one's own. So again, it's about networked interdependencies. Now, of course, there's a fine line between attempting to tease out the cultural affordances involved and presenting what might be read as an essentialist analysis, and Choi is perfectly aware of this. But this effort deserves credit, in my view, for confronting, if not perhaps finally satisfactorily addressing, the need to explain why such dramatic variations might occur in a world which, for some reason, has come to assume the inevitability of the impact of digital technologies on the production of culture without sufficiently considering other drivers of cultural change. That said, there'd be very few today who would see media globalisation operating as a one-way street, and many now recognise that the economies made possible by digital media production and distribution have played a significant part in complicated and perhaps even reversing the transnational flows in media content and strategic investment over the last decade. Digital technologies reduce the cost of production as well as the cost, in capital terms and in terms of the quality of the product, of copying and reproduction. The integration of low-cost television production with computer technologies brings TV production within the reach of not only the ordinary people responsible for user-generated content, but also within the reach of smaller local production industries. It's argued that the global content production is beginning to shift towards what Michael Curtin has called new media capitals, geolinguistic regional markets in East Asia and Latin America, where they have developed production capacities that enable them now in certain areas of production to convincingly compete with the US and Europe. Production industries in such locations can export their local content to diasporic, regional or other markets. They've had some success in exporting formats and even genres in the case of the telenovelas. And they have also found ways to de-globalise or localise the media that they import themselves. Anthony Fong's book, Global Capital and Local Culture, analyses this process in order to argue that while it might look like globalisation, China's strategic engagement with the global media companies has precisely such a domestic objective. That is, it is among the primary means through which the state is modernising its local media, and that's the point of their engagement with it. It's important to acknowledge that much of this has been driven by the vigorous commercialisation of the global media that has in turn been assisted by the confluence of highly supportive political environments. Since the early 1990s, the climate of deregulation and marketisation, which has been prosecuted to a greater or lesser degree and in various ways around the globe, has been a significant factor in the remaking of the media in general, not just those sectors involved in digital television. Neoliberal economic and communications policies have reformed national media systems, breaking up public broadcasting sectors and expediting the proliferation of commercial broadcasting and other media companies. Many of these new players are the convergent media enterprises that serve markets that previously would not have existed. As the prevailing climate of commercialisation becomes more widespread, increasingly, if gradually, the cost of television has been transferred from the advertiser or the state and onto the consumer. The task for television entrepreneurs in the post-broadcast market is to sell their service to consumers who are already receiving a broadcast service free of charge. Even in the most affluent markets, there are limitations to the extent to which these entrepreneurs can succeed, because the capacity to absorb the cost, and this is for entertainment, not the necessities of life, is unevenly distributed. Not only does this create an international digital divide, but it is also creating differentiated corridors of access within nations. And quote from John Sinclair, who's writing about Latin America, he says, "Television is becoming stratified, with convergent services for the elite who can afford them and free-to-air for the masses who can't. Since this division corresponds to real socio-economic differences in the population, it is most acute in developing world regions. In Latin America, for example, globalised elites can enjoy direct-to-home subscription television, while the ordinary people watch more traditional fare on the national networks. All over the world, such stratification and fragmentation of national audiences is presenting complex challenges for the television we have known." Such details indicate the difficulty in drawing conclusions about the market consequences of the digital challenge, and indeed what post-broadcast television will actually turn out to be for its stratified audiences in most places. The variations are simply too many and the objects too close for us to see them as a whole. What I'd like to do next is discuss some of the questions about what kinds of experience the emerging forms of television might offer their audiences, how they might construct community, and how might these potentials differ from those we identified with earlier mass communication models of television. Most would agree that where broadcasting has declined, what Lotz describes as, quote, "the emerging post-network era version of community," differs greatly from the network era one, which was created by watching common shows at a common time. And she goes on, "These are not communities in which people share reflections about television at water coolers or cocktail parties. Rather, they're the ones in which people communicate their favourites among peers and through online venues, and thereby create meaningful relationships. Communities of viewers sharing interests, favourites and self-produced content have merged to organise post-network viewing in the manner previously provided by the networks," unquote. Using a term coined by Chris Anderson, who's the author of the idea of the long tail, Lotz here describes the product of this organisation in a positive manner as generating what she calls as tribes of affinity. I have reservations about this kind of account because what it describes to me is the activity of the fan, the person who engages with television with a degree of intensity that could not be regarded as typical or representative. I don't think the futures of television should be read off the consumption practices of fans. Nonetheless, up to a point, I'm persuaded that there is a logic which leads from what Teresa Rizzo describes as the personalised playlist of the post-broadcast consumer to the creation of, perhaps, a highly prescribed, but nevertheless a community around the choices inscribed and which is facilitated by the technologies involved. I can see in such a context how television, in its various forms, becomes a category of content that is drawn down in order to construct social and personal identities for the individual, if not for the community. In the post-broadcast era, I've noted elsewhere, television has become increasingly involved in the production of identities, and many of the digital optimists have suggested that these identities tend to be personal rather than national. This is, of course, a significant point of differentiation between the functions of post-broadcast television and those of the broadcast era, or perhaps what we may soon be calling the mass communication era, during which it was widely argued that television was engaged in the production of citizenship. I'm thinking of work such as John Hartley's work during the 1990s. As the term mass media becomes a less appropriate descriptor for some digital media, the argument goes, the function of constructing national identities, of defining modes of citizenship, belonging and participation declines in importance as well. These broader national identities will not disappear, of course, but it is not yet clear precisely how they will be re-articulated to the fragmented mediascapes of Western democracies in the near future. Indeed, in some locations, there's an emerging policy orientation which questions the principles which might drive such a process. In the European Union's Television Without Borders initiative, and in some of the debates about the construction of Canadian television, the notion of national identity is resisted as a spurious and inappropriate means of constructing a sense of belonging, and therefore as an underpinning for communications policy. In its place, Beattie and Sullivan argue in relation to Canada, for instance, there should be a stronger sense of belonging to locality or the region on the one hand, and to a transnational community on the other. While such a position might be relatively uncontroversial in some Western democracies, there's plenty of evidence that it's not like that elsewhere. Emerging nation-states, such as those in the Balkans or the Middle East, continue to make routine use of television programming, drama, reality TV, soap opera, as well as news, as an explicit technique of nation formation. In China, the capacities provided by digital media, especially their replication of capitalist market economies' access to global entertainment product, are promoted by the state and welcomed by its citizens as evidence both of the new freedom attached to Western-style cosmopolitan consumption and of the nation's successful modernisation. Indeed, Anthony Fung argues that the processes of media globalisation have been so successfully harnessed by the modernising Chinese state that it has led, paradoxically, to the formation of a nationalised popular culture. Fung describes the consequences of a partnership between the Chinese state and global media capital as a form of neo-nationalism, in which individual consumption is linked both to the promise of modernity and of China claiming its rightful place as a global superpower. The audience's new cultural freedoms, then, to do with the release constraints upon the consumption of entertainment rather than upon their participation in politics, are easily incorporated into the service of the state. In fact, Wanning Sun and Yuzi Zhao have turned John Hartley's neologism about democratainment on its head and said that what they have in China is indoctritainment instead. In such a context, we should closely scrutinise the more optimistic claims about the political potential of the new modes of media consumption, not to mention the possibilities of Axel Brun's producerage. Where the state maintains firm control over the media, including the internet, in order to ensure its content does not dislodge government agendas, what is so routinely regarded as the liberalising political potential of the new media is necessarily compromised. In Singapore or China, for instance, the increased media choices now available through online social networking sites, video aggregators, blogging, and all the other accoutrements of the digital era certainly do provide the basic materials for the construction of personalised and individualised identities to particular sectors of the society. In both states, however, these materials are nonetheless regulated, their availability carefully articulated to the construction and renovation of national identities. In China, we know that the precise structure of this articulation has been negotiated directly between the digital provider and the state as part of the price of entry into the market. In order to gain access to the Chinese market, for instance, providers such as Google have signed up to formal agreements on internet practice, which installs local filters for the Chinese market and dramatically changes the way in which, say, the Chinese might generate and post user-generated content. And we are currently witnessing the playing out of the tension inherent in these arrangements as Google, and this is just my guess, find themselves unable to overcome the commercial effects of the restrictions required of them by the state. Now, this reminds us that a problematic feature of much of Western media studies discussion of post-broadcast television, convergence and the emerging capacities of the online environment is the politics of consumption most often attributed to it. Implicit in the coinage of terms like producer, in the vigorous interest in the phenomenal growth of user-generated or DIY content, and the focus upon the new time-shifting and playlisting opportunities with digital video, is a conviction that the digital revolution tips the balance of power away from the media corporations or the state and towards the interactive consumer. This complex of developments is seen as benefiting the user and not the corporation. The politics behind this privileging of the interests of the user is consistent with and indeed sees itself as reclaiming the ethical objectives that underpin traditional accounts of the democratic potential of mass communication. However, among the attributes customarily seen as fundamental to the democratic function of mass communication was universal access. By and large, information in the mass communication era was free. In the digital era, that is not quite so categorically the case, and the political consequences are significant. In Latin America, as we've seen already, and in China as well, there are internal and economically entrenched digital divides which skew media access towards the more affluent urban elites. Even in the US, there is debate now about the extent to which the benefits of the new media platforms will be accessible to everyone. The optimistic politics attributed to the expansion of the web and other interactive media are qualified significantly if there remains uncertainty about how many would or could adopt new technologies and ways of using television, even once content became available, as a result of differentials in the capacity to pay. Okay, so I'm moving towards my concluding section now. In an engaging piece posted on the online journal Flow, Karen Lurie has registered her sense of being disenfranchised from television as she learns to live in a post-TV world. Despite the fact that she earns her living as a television studies academic, she confesses to no longer watching network or scheduled television anymore at all. In fact, to not watching a television screen at all, but preferring to access video content via her computer. And this is why, she says, television has or used to have a public role that was not just about knowing something, but feeling. Television engages the private me, us, with public life, with a structure of feeling, to use Raymond Williams' well-worn phrase. Television used to mediate, however imperfectly, between private and public selves. As production and reception are privatised and tailored increasingly to individuals, that sense of the audience as a public, rather than a heavily invested community of fans or as a demographic, has eroded. The common culture of public concern and public sentiment, articulated by old TV, tried to secure public opinion, and in reality this was often met by a healthy mixture of participation, resistance and scorn. Nonetheless, it meant that we had something in common. In post-TV world, I no longer need to watch television that is not for me, and that is no longer about we. In fact, I might just as well read a book, unquote. It's a great piece that goes on for quite some time. Amanda Lotz raises a similar point, but in a slightly different way, by framing it as a conceptual question for the field of media studies. The changes which have shaped the multi-channel environment, she says, obviously have manifold consequences for the study of the media and its role in society. However, so far, the focus has been much more on mapping the technological and market shifts rather than these broader questions, such as, quote, the significance and repercussions of the erosion of the mass media, or how audiences exercising choice and control require us to revise fundamental ideas about media and culture. And she goes on, questions such as how cultures and subcultures come to know themselves and each other without widely shared programming, and how this affects perceptions of difference in society requires new thinking. Many assumptions of the mass nature of media undergird theories postulating the emancipatory potential of the media. And she finishes there. And I'm reminded of the discussion of sharedness we had on Friday with at the symposium. We need to rethink the role of television then, not just to map the shifts in its technical capacities, but to understand what it might do socially and how it might do it. This is related to questions about to what extent the media is any longer the mass media. And if the media is no longer mass, if it no longer gathers a heterogeneous national audience into a community, then what kinds of broad community function can it perform and how might its emancipatory potential be released. An observation commonly made about the tendencies underpinning the digital optimists to counter the television of the future is that the practices they predict are so highly individualised that they will fail to provide the experience of community so fundamental to the broadcast era. Not just the process of constructing citizenship, but also the more banal and everyday social engagement implied in industry nostrums about things like the water cooler effect. It's true that even though public broadcasting is shrinking in Europe and network television is in decline in the US, most commentators agree that even under the most radical of projections, there will continue to be an audience for live, broadcast, national event television. This seems to be the limit case for most of the live staging, for most critics. The live staging of the performances of community, national, transnational, regional, is still held to be among the essential functions of television, unlikely to be entirely displaced by other forms of distribution, even in the era of live streaming and Twitter. Here the continuities with the function of traditional media are reinforced and valued. However, in the US now, some commentators see only a very limited number of occasions upon which such events might occur. One reduces it to only the Super Bowl and the Olympics. Not much to build a TV channel on. Under such conditions, it's difficult to see how the capacity to provide such a service could be funded while broadcasting continued to decline in profitability. That is, if live broadcasting was only an occasional activity, how would the infrastructure required to provide this be sustained? As a result of some of such problems in relation to the European context, which has seen a dramatic disinvestment in public broadcasting over the last 2 decades, Jostein Gripsrud gloomily foresees live broadcast television declining into at best what he calls a residual presence over time. If that was to be the case, then a fundamental component of the experience of watching television, he says, would go with it. European broadcasting would have come to an end, and in its place, what we would have, according to Millie Bonanno, is narrowcasting, as television is handed over to the niche taste cultures of those sectors of the audience with commercial power. Kind of like that idea. There are other ways of looking at this, of course, and John Ellis has argued that among the key attributes of broadcast television has been the sense of co-presence, the perception that we are watching as part of a large, customarily national audience. Ellis argues that this constitutes a significant component in the character of our engagement with what we watch on television, and again it brings up the importance of sharedness. Clearly this is important when we are watching a national celebration, a high-profile sporting event, or a news event of national significance. Sharing our response to such moments becomes part of our sociality at the workplace, in the neighbourhood and within our communities. It might seem that the teenager constructing their menu of television clips from YouTube is not consuming television in this way. It may seem indeed that this is a highly individualised, expressly customised mode of consumption, and thus does not carry with it the sense of co-presence central to the consumption of traditional TV. I'm not sure that this is necessarily true. Rather, it might be the case that the nature of this co-presence has in many ways changed and expanded. Rather than just the co-present nation, for instance, what we might have is a co-present globalised taste culture or subculture to which the individual confirms their membership through their consumption of particular clips or participation or engagement through other kinds of tactics, comments, subscriptions and so on. Importantly, the transnational character of this taste culture may well be among its attractions, picking up on the preference of a more or less globalised audience or watching The Dancing Guy or the latest video from the international music industry. There certainly seems to be a prima facie case to argue that the consumption of these clips on YouTube and elsewhere is among the activities that provide the basic material from which that taste culture's sociality might be constructed. The imbrication of this culture within the growth of social networking technologies, and of course much of what is shared through these networks as video, would tend to support such a view. However, we still do not understand very much about the specifics of these new formations of co-presence, such as what forms of sociality are being promoted and how we can classify these as subcultures, if indeed we can call them that at all, given the constrained nature of the cultural connections the members can actually share. If we are to extend the frame of television to accommodate these new media networks and communities, and if they are to last, much more work still has to be carried out. That said, and not to exaggerate the novelty of the situation we're describing, it's also notable that so much of what is consumed through the video aggregator sites, and certainly so much of what makes up the list of the most viewed selections, actually comes from mainstream broadcast and subscription television. According to Burgess and Green, material from broadcast and mass media sources make up 66% of the most viewed category on YouTube and 47% of the videos which users have added to their personal profiles. I'm getting close to the end. It's undoubtedly the case that the uptake of some of the capacities of digital television and the effect of the character of the platforms upon which it has been mounted so far is changing the social practice of television in many locations and contexts. The rejection of appointment TV organised through a fixed programming schedule, the increasingly varied possibilities for the way television may now take its place in the routines of our daily life, the potential for user-generated content to reconfigure aspects of the familiar relations between production and consumption, and the likely effects of television's increasing engagement in the consumption of personal identity and perhaps its corresponding disengagement from the construction of community are just a few among many. The likely politics of these changes in practice cannot be allocated in advance. Indeed, I've found it's quite easy to read the same developments from quite contradictory points of view. And to some extent, such contradictions are a consequence of the point I made earlier, that big, overarching models of mass media production and consumption no longer appear to be as inclusive, comprehensive, or even as applicable as they might once have been. Nor are the developments under examination mutually exclusive, with the expansion of one necessarily resulting in the disappearance of the other. The transformation of television has significantly complicated what in retrospect seems to have been a relatively simple paradigm of mass communication. That is, a communication system focused on institutions or organisations more or less closely articulated to the operation of the state, freely accessible to all, concerned with the production of the citizen as a national subject, and taking as their potential audience the whole of the population of the nation-state. Now, this paradigm has not disappeared, of course, and in many places it's still well and truly in place, but in many other places its function and provenance is changing. Even this may be reversible, of course. We may find that there are ways in which the mass media can be re-embedded into our social, cultural and institutional systems. And there's an interesting article about a BBC program that uses that sends viewers off to an engagement with a website that is about the construction of citizenship. And James Bennett and Nikki Strange have written about this. At this point, though, it's probably more important to emphasise the fact that once the mass media begin to lose their massness in the ways I've been foreshadowing here, they become much more radically conjunctural, much more volatile and contingent in response to the precise configuration of the forces of change in particular socio-historical circumstances. And we need to be more responsive to that volatility in our developing accounts of the media and technological convergence. Thank you.